Here is a purple ink by Tag Kyo Sakuranezumi. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook. Here we get a very clean looking mid-tone dusty purple that I would completely understand why someone would go for this. Very little tone variation by pen, making this a very predictable ink to use. It shades fairly decent, fairly and consistently, adding to the excitement of what you write, no matter what you're writing, even if it's only a grocery list. Being it is light as it is as a tone, I was concerned about, being able to reread an entire page of this writing, but it hasn't been any kind of a problem, really making me think I might be interested in some of these lighter, dusty tones. The pen for today is a Duke 209. All of the writing samples are done with a Retro 51 P51 with an extra fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there, starting with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the extra fine nib, we see there's no problem with reading this tone on this page. It's light, it's that dusty as I described it, but it's easy to read, and an entire page of this really was no problem with this nib. Now, we get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get enough shading to make me happy with what I'm seeing. Take a look at back on the first line, how the B and the K both have their dark areas within them. Same with the word beginning on the first line. It really starts slightly darker, then it becomes a nice even mid-tone, darkening up at the G and the S, really giving a little bit of flair to the beginning and end of a word. Done very nicely. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than we had with the extra fine. No feathering, no spread. It is shading, I think, a little bit nicer in what's going on. We see it in owners where it starts lighter and it works its way just a little bit darker, where still on the first line, the word still, not still, although it is, yes, still on the first line, starts darker and works its way lighter. On the second line, odd goes from a little lighter to a little darker. Very gentle shading in this ink. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone that we get with the medium. No feathering, no spread. Shades very nicely. I was hoping that the stub would bring out more of the shading, and in certain aspects it did. Like you see it in the downstrokes of Gollum, or in the downstrokes in the L's of small or slimy. The end of creature, like anytime you back over a part, you see it in the E's. I think it's shading a pretty good and even a little bit better than it did with the medium. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here's the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There's approximately 6 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading, just that first darker letter of as. Just a light, dusty purple the whole way through, easy to read on the page. I would have preferred some shading, but this is not fountain pen friendly paper. It tends to perform well, but I like the tone that I'm seeing on the page. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine. tiny bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread. It is shading. Take a look at boat on the first line. Mid-tone gets a little bit lighter, darker at the T. Road on the second line, a little darker, a little on the R, a little lighter into the word, dark on the up and down stroke of the D. So it is shading here and doing a decent job of it. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we do get some shading coming in. You see it on the very first word, was a little darker, slightly lighter on the A and into the S, but darkens up at the S. Wide, starts dark and ends light, and or starts light and ends dark, and starts light and ends dark, which is a common theme in a bunch of the words here. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is just a tad bit darker than we had on the Clairfontaine. No real color shift. It's still very much a light dusty purple. Easy to read on the page. Not any easier for the tone of the paper, but not any harder either. No feather, no spread, still shading, perhaps shading just a little bit better than it did on the Clairfontaine with the extra fine. In each word, you certainly see some darker letters coming out, though it's like a darker mid-tone versus a lighter mid-tone, not all the way from light to dark. Looking at the medium nib, it is a tad bit darker than it was with the extra fine. Little lighter, I think, than it was on the Clairfontaine. No feather, no spread. It is shading. It's doing a very nice job at it. Look at grabbed. It starts as a darker mid-tone, gets to a lighter mid-tone, and then at the second B, it darkens up again with starting lighter, getting darker. Quickly starting lighter and getting darker, doing a very, very nice job all the way through. Happy that it maintained being an orange, where I was a little concerned it would lean towards a magenta here. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium. There is no feathering. There is no spread. There is shading. I think it shades a little better here than it did on the Clairfontaine. It really does, on any of the major up and down strokes, get darker, really drawing attention to it. Look at they on the second line, the H much darker, the Y at the end of it much darker, where never is a nice even mid-tone the whole way through. Found, the F on the downstroke gets a bit darker, lightens up in the word, until the D where it gets a little bit darker. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left. Pen flush is on the top right. 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, we get the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering. We get no spread. We get shading at the same level that it happened on the Clairfontaine. It is a standout enough color that seeing what's happening with the vertical lines isn't any kind of a problem. It's just dark enough to really cross that bridge. If it was a little bit lighter, those vertical lines might be detracting from some of this ink on the page. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the extra fine. Right about the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering. We get no spread. We do get some shading. Take a look at feeling. Starts lighter, starts darker, gets a bit lighter, starts showing some dark spots in the word like the I and the G. That starting light, getting dark at the H, lightening up at the A, and dark again at the T. Really looking outstanding here. Looking at the stub nib, it is a tad bit darker than it was with the medium, which is a tad bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. There's no feathering, there's no spread. The shading is better, without a doubt, than it was on the Clairfontaine. You really see it in from one word to the next, on to the, on the first line. Very nice. A lake starting dark, lightening up in the middle, getting dark again at the A. When as a nice solid mid-tone the whole way through it. And look at tunneling on the second line. A lot of tone shifting from lighter midtones to darker midtones within that one word. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and have no problems.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diatramentis Giacomo Puccini Aubergine. Here is KWZ Iron Gall Violet No. 2. Here is Organic Studios Vanadium. Here is Robert Oster Hippo Purple. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is right about the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering. We get no spread. We get spots of shading. Now we're going from a lighter midtone to a darker midtone with occasional dark letters, like in there or there on the first line, where we get some of the darker letters. But if you look at the second line, and is a nice midtone, the D starts getting a little bit lighter. There, right next to it, light to dark on the H, lighter again into the ER, darker midtone on that final E. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the extra fine, a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get no shading, solid mid-tone, dusty purple the whole way. I do think this looks very nice, but I think this might be a little light for note-taking in a class with this. You know, I wouldn't take points off for it, but I wouldn't give you extra points for it either. Looking at the stub nib, it is a little bit darker than it was with the medium, tiny bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread, still no shading with this, but this is not a problem for the ink. It is the paper that tends to use up the shading and not really have it available here. I think the color we're getting is very nice though. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting. Great for a student being able to write back here.
While it's nice to see color comparables, I prefer to see an ink that complements the color on the page. Here is a green ink by Diamine Classic Green. Here is a gray ink by Pen BBS number 130. Here is a pink ink by Monteverde Rose Pink. Here is a yellow ink by Califolio Horidori. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather and does spread. Now, neither the feathering or the spreading here seems to be any kind of a problem that should stop you from using it. I think you're getting a very nice tone the whole way through, but I feel like you kind of miss out on some of the real beauty of this ink here on this paper. It looks nice, but it looks nicer on so many other papers. And no shading. Looking at the medium nib, it is darker than it was with the extra fine, bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering. Sorry, it was a habit, really. We get feathering, not out of control. Anywhere it's a little bit darker, it's there. Like, look at the on the first line or all together on the third line, it's there. The spread's there, it's not out of control. Neither the feathering or the spread are any kind of a real issue. Other than that, they're there, and other than that, I can get decent paper at a relatively affordable price that I can't see using this with this ink. So as I did point out, it does shade. We do see some darker areas occurring. But when it shades, it spreads a little more and feathers a little more. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, which is a tad bit darker than we had on the Clairfontaine. We do get feathering, smaller than on the medium. We do get some spread, which, you know, can be harder to judge, but considering I get to look at them side by side, I can see it. If I didn't see it side by side, I wouldn't really see the spread that's happening here with the stub. So the minor feathering and the spread, I don't see as a huge deal. Do we get shading? We get a couple darker spots. I don't really want to call it shading so much as we're getting spots that it's absorbing into the paper faster. Looking at the page underneath, there was only one spot with the stub where I hesitated, leaving the nib on the paper a little bit longer, that it did bleed through, touching the page underneath, so not any kind of a real issue. And seeing the back of the page, there's ghosting that you couldn't write back here, but I don't think this is horrible. Again, this is copy paper, the worst thing humans have ever created.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
Perhaps the comment that the 20-pound copy paper is the worst thing humans ever created is a little extreme, but I'll waver on it if you really want to have an issue. Undoubtedly, this is a dealer's choice because of how consistent the tone, the performance, and the shading. And that said, while it can go in any pen and do a very good job, personally, I would avoid your drier fine pens for fear of it getting any lighter. And if it got lighter, I feel like it might become unreadable looking back or unreadable over a whole page. It is always going to be a good ink to be able to use as a secondary because it's not going to draw all of the attention from your primary writing.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching.